It is good to be back with you, dear friends. It seems like it's been an awfully long time. I told the 8 o'clock congregation, gee, I'm glad I chose this summer to be away because nothing much was happening in the world. So I didn't miss anything. Unfortunately, that was not the case. I have been many places, I've read many books, I've met many people. You'd think I would have one of those stories to open with, but in fact I don't. I open with a YouTube video. A couple weeks ago, Father Jim said, you got to watch this one. It's called Why I Hate the Episcopal Church. I thought, well, that would be a good learning experience, surely. So I did. It turned out to be one in a series done by a young guy who grew up in a very conservative evangelical church and had left it and now considered himself to be atheist, but who then comments on other churches. And for an atheist, he spends an awful lot of time in churches. That's another story to be discussed with him on another day. In any case, he said that when he wants to have spiritual peace and a calm sort of religious experience, he goes to an Episcopal church. And it turns out he lives in North Carolina, so one Sunday in June, he went to Christ Church Raleigh. Anybody who's from North Carolina, you'll know this is big, rich church. This is the full show of the Episcopal church. And he happened to be there on the Sunday when they were saying goodbye to their high school students who were graduating and going away. And as most churches do on that occasion, they got the students to get up and give a little talk, what they loved about the church, what they would miss, what it had meant to them in their lives. And for the most part, what they talked about was how it had been a nurturing place. It was a safe place where they could feel like they could develop their faith. They loved their friends. They loved youth group. They loved the community that they had there. And that was what he found irritating. Granted, he was being a little facetious about this, but his point was that he and his friends growing up in a conservative evangelical church had not felt that way. They had felt a constant inner struggle to decide whether they were really, truly being fully disciples of Christ, whether every choice they made was in line with what Jesus would do, whether they were using everything in their life to proclaim the gospel as fully as they could, and they were constantly under stress, wondering if they were doing it right. Now, there are a couple of cautions in this story before I even go any further. The first is to say, you'll notice that he left that. Apparently, he was unable to find a way to stay in that community and have it be fulfilling for his faith, what he felt he needed to do, what he needed to do, and so he had left it. That's worth pondering. The second point also is that I'm out of practice of doing this. What is this? Oh, yes, it's a sin of pride. How could I forget? Very often, you and I, when we think of the sin of pride, we think of, am I pretty enough? Am I rich enough? Am I popular enough? Am I successful enough? There's an even deeper sin of pride, which is to say, am I scoring points with God? Am I doing what I need to do to ensure that I am on the right side of God's book because I can save myself if I work hard enough? Both of those are important things to think about when imagining what a proper Christian life is like. But not to take anything away from those high school students in Raleigh, I think it's fair to say that for all of us, there is a certain amount of struggle that goes on in our hearts all the time, regardless of what sort of church we go to on Sunday. I mean, I hardly even need to list the categories. There is the stress of the disparity between me and God. And I'll speak only for myself, but I am well aware of my sinfulness, my frailties, the ways in which I fail to do what I ought to do as a follower of Jesus. That creates a certain amount of tension in me, because although I'm not spending every minute wondering whether every little choice I make is necessarily the right one, there is at least that awareness in my head that my choices matter. Then, going back to the quiet and peaceful world this summer, there is the clear gulf between the world as it is, we as humanity, and what it is that God desires for the world and for humanity, for every one of us. How much love and mercy have you seen poured out into the world by our fellow humans this summer? as we criminalize homelessness, as celebrities decide they're going to become cops for a day to go look for illegal aliens or whatever that they think they're doing, as other nations fight it out with one another, engage in ethnic cleansing, wholesale removal of populations, use of starvation as an instrument of government power. How can we possibly not feel the stress of the world as it is? And that is before we even look into our own hearts, into our own buildings, and ask how we as Christians are treating one another. I have been this summer to a place where there's a church every 5 feet, and most of them are that way because in the first church they decided they didn't like each other, so half of them left and started a second church. And some of them didn't like each other and went down the street and started a third church. Some other people came and they started a whole new denomination, and before you know it, there's 500 denominations, each with about 50 people in them. Is this the unity that Jesus prayed for? I think not. It would be easy enough to look at the world and see nothing but struggle. It would be easy to look at the Christian faith and see nothing but struggle. I've told you before about one of the hymns in the hymnal. It's called "The Peace of God, It Is No Peace." It talks about the lives of some of the immediate followers of Jesus and the difficulties they had in trying to live out their ministries. We all feel it. So the question is, what are we to make of this? What good news is there in all of this? I think there is some, but we have to learn first how to approach the struggle, how to manage the struggle, how to recognize what the struggle is really for. And so I have a few thoughts for you on that this morning. The first is to say upfront, out loud, that the struggle is real, using the language of the young people of today. What we see that offends us, what we see that disturbs us, what we see that is wrong ought to bother us. It ought to create stress in us. If it didn't, that would be a bigger problem. Can I get an amen? Huh. If we were to look at the world and see everything as perfect, how far would we be from seeing with the eyes of God? Because that, dear friends, is the hard part for us as Christians. It would be so much easier sometimes to see the world through the eyes of politics, through the eyes of power, through the eyes of personal advantage. But you and I are called to do something harder, to see the world through the eyes of God, to see the world the way God desires it to be, with all the brokenness that there is present, but to see it with the eyes of love and mercy, and to respond accordingly. But until we see it, we can't. If we will not open our eyes and see all of the problems of the world, if we won't allow that struggle to happen in our hearts, how will we ever get up off the couch and go out and do something? So, dear friends, the struggle is real and it's there for a purpose. To wake us up, hopefully to push us out the door just a little faster. The second important point is not to sweat the small stuff. There was a book written 20 years ago called "Don't Sweat the Small Stuff," and it's all small stuff. Well, that's not quite true. There is some stuff that really does matter. But the important thing is to be able to see it, especially when it comes right up and gets in your face. That happened to me this summer. I was honored to be invited to go speak to the student body of the Martoma Seminary in Kerala. And they're all sitting there, I'm up in front, and they're expecting me to have wisdom. So I made a few comments that were completely forgettable. And then they opened it up for questions. And the first few questions were softball, and I had pretty good answers. I've been doing this for a while. I'm slick enough after 25 years as a professor and 16 as a priest that I can come up with a thinking on my feet kind of answer. But then one student got up and said, "We live in a culture where Christians are actively persecuted. There are several states in northern India that have now made conversion illegal. There are clergy that are harassed. There are church buildings that are vandalized. There are places where people are actively prevented from practicing their religion, and when they try, they are taking their lives and their safety in their own hands. Keep in mind that in the population of India, only 2% are Christian. And they don't all live in big enclaves in cities. There's a dribble and drab there in different little towns where they're completely surrounded by other people. This guy asked me, we live in that culture. What advice do you have for us? Yeah, you can imagine how quickly the humility had to take over at that point. And I had to say, I have come among you as one without answers. I don't live in that culture. Certainly, coming back, it made me recognize how often we complain about the difficulties that we have, how often we talk about the blocks and boundaries we have to accomplishing anything, how often I need to look at those for what they really are, and how much of them really are in the category of the small stuff. Jesus is trying to point us toward that in the lesson this morning when he goes through the different family relationships that are going to end up hating each other. He's trying to point us toward the relationships that matter. In their culture, in his culture at the time, that would have been what really did matter. Other things did too, but certainly to people he was speaking to, they would have recognized, if you don't have your family, you're in great danger, great difficulty in a culture where nobody else is going to help you. So he's trying to point us toward that necessary sorting out of what those essential relationships are, what really matters, and making sure we can direct our energy toward those things that really matter. There may not be any less struggle that way, but at least the struggle will be pointing toward the things that may actually bring transformation in the world. When Jesus talks about bringing a sword, remember, a sword doesn't just wound, a sword also divides. It can cut away the things that don't really matter, leaving those that really do, that perhaps we couldn't even see. And then last, yet another word from the young. I think struggle is a feature, not a bug. I think struggle is built into what the Christian experience is supposed to be about. I mean, Jesus says it himself in the lesson this morning. I am under great stress until this work is completed. If that was true for him, why should it not be true for us? One of the books that I read early in the summer made the point that the church is only really alive when it is existing in the crisis of the life of God. I told this to the vestry at our retreat a couple weeks ago. I hope they're still chewing on it. I am after 3 or 4 months. What does that mean? I think it means that God chooses to take a big risk in coming into human life in the person of Jesus. We take a big risk entering into the life of God, and yet it is the only way that we're truly alive. The way we know that we are on the right path is because by seeing with the eyes of God and seeing the brokenness of the world, we are finally moved to do something to improve it. So, dear friends, I'm back. After a summer when a lot happened and nothing happened, and here we are, faced once again with the struggle. What would God have us do next? I hope that is what is fermenting, germinating in our hearts at this time of the year. And always, where is God calling us to go now? We have only to be open to the struggle of the life of God, and it will become clear to us. Amen.